Welcome to another episode of Off the Menu. I'm your host, Vincent Franchini from Tumblr House, here with a cogent Charles Coulombe.
Cogent? You mean like I'm making sense?
Yeah.
Wow.
You're fresh off a debate?
Yes, that's true. And it was a very pleasant debate, very civil, which is not always the thing today. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And it was a typical product of the 21st century.
Oh, tell us about it.
Well, my interlocutor, the Eric Morse, the gentleman with whom I was not exactly debating, but dialoguing, I guess you would say, was in San Antonio, Texas. The moderator was in Madrid, Spain. No, sorry, the moderator was in Quito, Ecuador. And the sound man and tech guy was in Madrid, Spain. And I was here in Austria. So welcome to the globalism of the 21st century. Ladies and gentlemen, you may be beaten down into your houses by COVID. You may be cowering in your homes because of the burning and looting and mayhem on your streets. But heavens to Murgatroyd, we are all united through the medium of the internet. Yes, indeed, we are just little neighborhoods on that information superhighway.
That's a beautiful thought, Charles.
Isn't it? I liked it. But, you know, one thing about the information superhighway is that there aren't any parking spots. And there's none of those beautiful islands, you know, like with palm trees and stuff in the middle of it.
That's right. In the words of the late, Senator Ted Stevens, the internet is a series of tubes. That's actually a very old meme. That's like when in the advent of the internet, where the senator quite clearly couldn't wrap his head around what the internet was, and he was giving a speech to Congress about it, it was pretty cringe, but it's amusing.
Well, you heard Vice President Biden's latest about the internet.
No, I didn't.
Yeah, he says he really enjoys being on Prodigy.
I used Prodigy. Wow.
So did I.
Wow.
He really enjoys it.
That's
he says there are these things called BBs, he calls them, that he writes stuff on.
I don't recall those. What is that?
It was BBS, but he calls them BBs.
Huh.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good.
No, I'm excited for him. You know, Prodigy was a great discovery for me 23 years ago.
Yeah.
So I'm glad he's enjoying it.
All right. We are going to jump right into it. So this is a special episode because we hit a new goal on Patreon, where we're going to do more of these catch-up episodes to sort of get through a lot of these questions. And today we're doing 20 questions from non-patrons. This is normal.
20 non-patron questions. This is to show you, and see right now, especially while people are rioting over discrimination and stuff, this is to show everybody out there that Tumblr House is not discriminating. 20 non-patron questions. You folks who are being answered today didn't pay a dime for the privilege.
That's right. So
void were prohibited. Act now. Act now while supplies last.
That's right. Okay, let's get into them. The first question is from Egil Cross. Quote, Rome will lose the faith, end quote. This line echoes strongly among traditionalists nowadays, given the state of the church. But I wanted to task Mr. Coulombe, what proof is there that this part from the La Salette visions actually comes from our mother? It is not in the official La Salette website transcription, but if Rome really is corrupted, it is not a stretch to think they'd like to hide this part of Our Lady's message.
You're right, and the answer is I don't know. I have no idea. I'm simply not conversant enough with the message of La Salette to give you an answer. I know about the apparition, of course. I've got an outline knowledge of its history and so on and so forth. But I really can't give you a decent answer, and I apologize.
All right. Question from Thomas. What is your opinion on Charles de Gaulle? Was he a great Catholic statesman, last in line to the great leaders of France?
Oh, that's a really good question. It really is, because Charles de Gaulle is a figure that I have wrestled with my entire life, bearing in mind that he was the president of France when I first became conscious, and bearing in mind also that I remember very well the demonstrations and revolts in '68 in Europe, which would eventually drive him from power in '69. And I can remember his death in 70, I guess it was, 1970. I remember the funeral was an all-day affair on American television. Coulombe des Églises, that being the town where he was from. De Gaulle was an interesting character. My dad had a great deal of respect for him as the leader of Free France during the war. There was a good side and there was a bad side to Charles de Gaulle. The good side, he loved France. He did his best to restore a shattered country to great power status. And he put, to the best of his ability, he did try to put France's interests above those of anyone else. That was the plus side. The downside. He certainly, I think, was ungrateful, you might say, although one appreciates his commutation of the death sentence to his former mentor, Marshal Pétain, who was really in an impossible situation as the leader of Vichy France. But so was de Gaulle as leader of Free France. They were both, Pétain had Hitler constantly and the Germans constantly chiseling away at Vichy France's position. And de Gaulle had to deal with Roosevelt, constantly trying to chisel away at him and at Free France. And one of the things that I will always admire de Gaulle for was the way that he took Guadeloupe and Martinique from the Vichy authorities, despite Roosevelt having forbidden him to do so. He claimed to be a monarchist of sorts, and some people maintain that if he had had the chance, if he had not been gone through '68, he would have restored the Count of Paris to the throne of France. Now, being a legitimist, I wouldn't be all that happy at seeing an Orleanist as king, but better an Orleanist, I guess, than a president. But then others say, actually, that he duped the Count of Paris and had no intention of a restoration. I have no way of knowing how sincere. I've read certainly some of his letters with the Count of Paris. I have no idea of knowing how sincere he was. He knuckled under to American pressure over Algeria, and the Algerian thing would always stick in my craw. 1 million Frenchmen having to leave a country in 2 weeks, in which the majority of them, their families had lived there for over a century and never even seen France. That's tough. And all because JFK issued an ultimatum that if he didn't get out of Algeria, we would cut off all military aid, which at that time France was dependent on. Of course, it was immediately that horrible thing was over. De Gaulle immediately jumped into building up a big French arms industry, quite successfully, so that when he crossed swords with Johnson a few years later, he didn't have to back down. but still, the damage was done over Algeria. And a lot of, not just Pieds Noirs, who were the French settlers, but the Harkis, who were the native Algerians who were loyal to France. A lot of suffering. And, of course, the French who opposed this tried a coup d'etat against him, which failed. And de Gaulle was very draconian in his dealing with them afterwards. So, mixed book. Personally, he certainly was a believing Catholic, no doubt about that. So on the whole, plus or minus, good guy, bad guy, conflicted. I certainly admire the way he handled Roosevelt, who never, ever, ever missed a chance to try to do him in. And he always outwitted him. That's a story that most Americans aren't familiar with. When all they remember is de Gaulle being difficult. Well, he had reason to be difficult, because every time he dealt with the Americans, he gets stabbed in the back. And after a while, when you've got 7 or 8 knives in your back, you begin to wonder what that's about. I don't get it. How come I've got this pain in my back? And I was proud of him, frankly. When LBJ, by this time France had developed a nuclear arsenal of its own, and LBJ demanded the keys to the new French nuclear silos the way he had gotten them from the British. And de Gaulle said, well, let me ask you a question. Would you be willing to sacrifice New York for Paris? He said, certainly not. And de Gaulle said, well, I wouldn't expect you to make any other answer. But that's why you're not getting the keys to the nuclear silos. That's why you're not going to have control of our nuclear arsenal, because you had to answer that way. So LBJ says, you give me control of your nuclear force or get out of NATO, thinking that was the ultimate threat. And de Gaulle said, well, I'm not happy about it, but... So he left the military aspect of the alliance, not the political alliance, but the military. And it turned out being worse for NATO, because its headquarters and all that kind of thing were in France. So they had to move everything to Belgium, and that was very costly and unhappy making. And it also meant that the American Navy didn't have automatic access to French naval and air bases around the world. And that was very inconvenient. But, So, how do I feel about de Gaulle? Either and both. He could have been a greater man than he was, but he did some good things, and that's how I feel about Charles de Gaulle. He was sort of an icon of my childhood, like Chiang Kai-shek, like Churchill, like Adenauer. And I remember, as each of these characters died, I remember a great sadness when they died, because they were the last grown-ups in a sense. So I mean, a lot of French royalists of both varieties really disliked de Gaulle, and I understand that. And a lot of admirers of Le Maréchal can't stand him either, and I understand that too. And then other people think that he's the most wonderful thing since plaid paint because of his part in the resistance and later on. And I understand that. So I guess I would have to say about Charles de Gaulle, I am extremely ambivalent.
Okay. Next question is from Oliveira. Hello, my fellow friends. I am a youngster discerning my vocation and have one problem. My parents and even my brothers think that I am surely born to be a married man. But besides having no problem with that, I don't know why I shouldn't dedicate myself to serving others and God as a priest. How can I figure it out?
Well, the only way you can figure out is by trying it, really. I don't know how old you are, but remember that the reason why the priesthood has things like, there's certainly orders religious orders have things like postulancy and novitiate, is so that you can test your vocation. And if you don't have a vocation to the priesthood, you'll bounce out quick enough. You know, at the end of the day, you have to live your own life. Your parents and your relations can't live it for you. But I will ask you to ask yourself the question that my father asked me when I came to him with this, which was, if you were able to offer the Mass, and for some reason or other you couldn't do it on a given day, would you be upset? And if you wouldn't be, you shouldn't be a priest. Because the offering of the Mass should and must be the center of every priest's life. Everything else is secondary. But offering the Mass, hearing confessions, that is the meat and potatoes of the priestly life, or should be. The salvation of souls via the sacraments. So that's what you have to ask yourself. But anyway, I wish you luck. Discerning your vocation, particularly today, is no easy deal. So pray very, very hard to the Holy Ghost, and also be open to God's actions in your life just through events. You know, you said, sorry?
No, I was going to say, yeah, pray to the Holy Ghost for the gift of understanding. And I say this a lot. No one receives the gift of of understanding for someone else.
Yeah.
Only you can understand. Only you can receive the gift for yourself. So when it comes to your parents and your brothers, they only you can know.
I want the gift of understanding for everyone else, but I don't want it for myself. So
well, that's how everyone acts all the time.
Well, yeah, because see, this way I can tell everybody else what to do without having the first idea of what to do about myself. And I can just do whatever I want for me, while advising everybody else about what they should do.
That's incredibly modern.
I know. I've caught up with the times.
All right. Question from Nick. Dear Charles, we know that Henry VIII's schism with Rome was obviously catastrophic and intrinsically evil. However, the question that still looms in the air for me is that, even if he didn't break with Rome, how would his succession plan problem been solved? He would have needed to solve it if he was to avoid another dynastic war after his death. Could Mary Stuart have become Queen of England? I'd like to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, I think so. I mean, if it hadn't been for the Reformation, I think that in all likelihood, Mary could have succeeded at the throne of England peacefully, which incidentally is what the last round of Tudor-Stuart weddings have been about, was to bring an end to that conflict through, peacefully. And also, if you think about it, without Elizabeth or Edward around, just with Princess Mary, you would have had kind of a seamless, presuming that Mary, not having been abused all her young life, had not been capable of producing an heir. See, that's the other wild card. But had Mary not produced an heir to the throne, one could almost see a seamless passing on from Mary I to Mary II.
Okay. Question from Eric. I have a question for Charles. I converted to the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. The Roman Catholic Church says that my church has valid sacraments. My baptism, chrismation, communion are all valid. Since Pope Francis has done so much harm, why shouldn't we encourage orthodoxy as an option instead of joining the Roman Church? My church bookstore even sold me a book that condemned birth control, which I agree with. Since you seem to consider us another branch in the same church, why not encourage those considering Catholicism to also look at orthodoxy? All the best Orthodox theologians oppose birth control, by the way.
Well, that's a very, very good question. I want to start from the, first I want to say something about the last comment and then go back to the top. as far as the best Orthodox theologians, the problem is that in Orthodoxy, nobody can define what that means. And the most popular one in the West is Bishop Callistos Ware, who has a book on the Orthodox faith that is probably the best known manual on Orthodoxy in the West. The first edition condemns birth control and abortion back in the 50s. And bit by bit by bit, in every subsequent edition, it's gotten less and less and less so. And now I think he might have even gotten kind of soft on gaiety in some way or other. So the problem with quote-unquote Western Orthodox is that you get sort of a shifting sand. Let's go back to the first thing. Let me say a couple of things about the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. First, I have a little experience with it, believe it or not. Partly in Washington, partly in LA. And I have to say that I've got a great deal of admiration for a lot of the Ethiopian Orthodox. I'm certainly very fond of Haile Selassie, who was the emperor of Ethiopia in my childhood and boyhood, and who was another figure like Chiang Kai-shek, like Charles de Gaulle, like Churchill, who had been there forever, you know, and whose overthrow and murder I mourn to this day, just as I do the horrible Ethiopian revolution that destroyed church and state and really was monstrous. What you say about the Catholic Church's view of Ethiopian Orthodox sacraments and so on is quite true, absolutely. And I'll say this also, that the Ethiopian Orthodox I've known have usually been extremely devout, very pious. All right, so far so good. Why would we not encourage people to become Orthodox? Well, there's a world of difference between those who are born Orthodox and Westerners going into it. One of the problems you have with all Orthodoxy, and incidentally, don't forget that there's a big division within Orthodoxy between what is called Chalcedonian Orthodoxy, i.e. the Eastern Orthodox churches as we think of them. That is to say, the Patriarchate of Moscow, the Patriarchate of Constantinople, who've excommunicated each other, the Patriarchates of Antioch and Jerusalem, the Romanian, Serbian, Greek, Albanian, Bulgarian Orthodox churches, the Orthodox Church in America, all those guys, and what are called the non-Chalcedonian or Oriental Orthodox churches. And these include the Armenian Gregorian Church, Armenian Apostolic Church, the Syriac Orthodox Church, the Indian Orthodox Church in Malabar, the Coptic Orthodox Church in Egypt, and their daughter, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church. Now, of course, the big division is supposed to be over Monophysitism. I do understand the non-Chalcedonians are no longer, if they ever were, a Monophysite. I know that. Nevertheless, there's that big division between the one and the other. And it's pretty nasty. Sometimes the Holy Sepulchre, you'll get into fights between the Armenians and the Greeks, the Greek and Armenian monks that are never fun. Of course, when our Franciscans join in, it really gets bad. Anyway, I mention this because there's no Orthodox church. There are Orthodox churches. And as we know, even amongst the Chalcedonians, Moscow and Constantinople have excommunicated each other. So I could hardly recommend to a Westerner converting to Orthodoxy. Usually, in my experience, when people do so, it's to escape the papacy. And even though Pope Francis often feels like a good guy to escape from, I have lived under, let me count them, John the 23rd, Paul the 6th, John Paul I, John Paul II, Benedict. So this is the 6th Pope I lived under. Some of them were better, some of them were worse. Benedict was my favorite, and he was the most recent. So it doesn't matter, though, what I like. It is about the papacy itself, about the papal office, which doesn't change. And as you may have noticed, in recent months, there's been a lot of annoyance and anguish in certain places like Germany that Francis is not doing what he's supposed to do. Rubber stamp everything they want. And the same was true with Paul VI. I don't like him because I lived under him, but I'm certainly grateful for Humane Vitae. And presuming that he's in heaven since he was canonized, I can only presume that the agony of his last 10 years after doing Humane Vitae and bringing upon himself the hatred of the whole world, including many of the bishops, I could see where that probably pushed him over the edge. So that is why I do not encourage Western people to become Orthodox. I would also point out to you that there is an Ethiopian Catholic Church, which every Orthodox church not in communion with Rome has an equivalent in communion with Rome. Byzantine, Syriac, Armenian, Coptic, Ethiopian, Malankara, Syro-Malabar. Oddly enough, however, there is one Eastern Catholic Church in communion with Rome that has no non-Catholic equivalent, and that's the Maronites. All Maronites are Catholic. There are no Maronite Orthodox. Doesn't exist. But so anyway, that's my answer to you. But again, I have a lot of affection for Ethiopia and the Ethiopians as a people, for the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, and again, for the memory of Haile Selassie and for the Ethiopian imperial line, which, after all, were the only Christian emperors around when I myself was alive, reigning Christian emperors. And they made a big deal about that, let me tell you, I remember.
I guess a second question from Eric. My church also has more fast days, more severe fasting, a much longer liturgy that can go for hours, and a lot more sacramentals. Additionally, Pope Francis called efforts to convert other Christians, quote, pious nonsense, making clear that he doesn't believe we need to join the Catholic Church. Is he not infallible on matters of faith, thus he cannot be wrong about this?
He could certainly be wrong about it because he was not speaking ex cathedra. Papal infallibility does not mean that everything that comes out of a pope's mouth is infallible. The only things that, strictly speaking, are infallible are when a pope specifically invokes infallibility. He speaks ex cathedra from the chair of Peter, intending to bind the whole church. This has never occurred in my lifetime. The last time it happened was in 1950, when Pope Pius XII defined the dogma of the Assumption of Mary into heaven. It's interesting to note that most Orthodox believed that until Pope Pius XII defined it, at which time a lot of Orthodox began denying it. There's a problem with that, and that is that an awful lot of Orthodox churches, including the one in Moscow, the big cathedral, are named Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary. So that is a little problematic. And that's one thing, I'm sorry to say, that you'll often find with the Orthodox. To a degree with us and very much with each other, they love to come up with reasons to fight. They really do. If you don't believe me, ask the new calendarists about the old calendarists and vice versa. And I just recommend you read the arguments between Constantinople and Moscow against each other. Don't ask any member of either church about them, because they'll really flame out at you. And I'm chuckling, but it's a dry chuckle. I'm not happy about it at all. I hate the schism between East and West. So you can imagine how much I hate something like the one between Constantinople and Moscow. As far as the ritual and so forth of the Ethiopian church, it's identical to that of the Ethiopian Catholic Church. So,
Do Orthodox have an inherently deficient view of the concept of authority?
I really believe they do, because, again, they would say, and any Orthodox there, you can feel free to write nasty notes correcting me in case I'm wrong, but they would say that ultimately the authoritative, the ultimate authority are the 7 ecumenical councils that they accept. They will tell you that an ecumenical council is the highest authority in the church. However, they will also say, many of them anyway, that you can't have an ecumenical council without the Pope of Rome presiding. And since that can't happen, there won't be another ecumenical council. Their attempt to have a pan-Orthodox synod exploded into nothing. And the thing is, no Orthodox living today can speak with authority on behalf of the whole Orthodox churches.
Yeah.
I'll give you an example, all right? Now, certain Orthodox maintain that we Latins are heretics. And because we're heretics, our sacraments are invalid. And all Catholic sacraments are invalid. You will see this argument made a lot of times at places. Well, all right. But when I've heard this, I immediately say, okay, are you familiar with, there were a lot of Eastern Catholics who were forced out of union with Rome in 1831 by the Tsar of Russia, in Ukraine and in Belarus. They were forced out of union and back into Orthodoxy in 1831 en masse, bishops, priests, and laity. The same thing happened in Romania and Ruthenia and so forth in Ukraine in 1948 at the behest of the communists. So, Catholic sacraments are invalid because we're heretics, okay? Of all those bishops and priests, both in 1831 and 1948, how many were reordained?
I don't know.
How many were rebaptized? Now, which church authority at the time told either the Tsar or the communists had the authority to decide that issue? Nobody. So, where the Orthodox are very strong, and I salute them, is they're certainly strong in their belief in the sacraments, in their belief in the church tradition, in their maintenance of customs. They're great. The problem is that once you get beyond that, everyday life, if you will, you run into problems. And they're very difficult problems. And they're not problems that are easily solved. And that in and of itself, orthodoxy is incapable of solving by its own admission. And inevitably, if an Orthodox expresses an opinion, and you bring up the contrary opinion held by some other Orthodox, their response will be, oh, well, he's not really Orthodox. Okay, and you are, all right? Upon what basis do you say that? I'm sure he would say the same thing. So who's right? Well, I am. Okay, well, he'll say the same thing. And, you know, again, as I've said before, I do not recognize the current schism as being binding in conscience, which is why if I were in danger of death, I'd have no problem going to an Orthodox priest for communion, if he would give it to me, which is a whole other issue. But I'd have absolutely no problem in doing so. Why? Because, number one, juridically, the schism we have today only goes back to 1462. Now the Ethiopian church is a whole other case, but in terms of the Chalcedonian Orthodox churches, the Union of Florence was disrupted in 1462 by Patriarch Gennadios II, who was made patriarch by the Sultan, having conquered Constantinople, for the express purpose of ending the Union. And he did. Now, Gennadios was an interesting character because, again, you'll hear a lot of Orthodox saying that scholasticism is evil, especially Thomism. Now, people know I'm not a great Thomist myself, but I'd never say it was evil. Gennadios II was a Thomist, but he disagreed with St. Thomas in two areas. Where? The papacy, obviously, and the Immaculate Conception, which he accepted and St. Thomas denied. But ever since 1853, or 1854 rather, when Pope Pius IX defined the Immaculate Conception, most Orthodox theologians have denied it, as with the Assumption. So, it's a big mess, and I simply cannot recognize a schism put forth by a man who was appointed for the purpose by the Sultan. Moreover, the juridical basis upon which it rested were the mutual excommunications between the Pope and the Patriarch of Constantinople. Those were lifted in 1964. So I can see no juridical and no spiritual basis for the schism except mere custom, except people are used to it. And I'll end my oration on it by saying, by quoting the current Patriarch of Moscow when he was the Metropolitan of Smolensk. Yes, and I know since then he's expressed other views about other things. But at the time, he made what I think was an utterly true statement, and I endorse it completely. He said, schism is like divorce. And like divorce, it's the result of sin. And it won't end, no matter how many papers you sign, how many agreements you come to, until both sides realize that they have an obligation to love one another and need each other. And I believe that to be completely true. We absolutely, positively need, we need each other, if nothing else, to correct each other's excesses, which I think today are blatant between what's going on in Rome at the present and the schism between Moscow and Constantinople. It's almost the reductio ad absurdum of our worst tendencies. And what are those tendencies? Well, I'll put it in two different jokes, which I've done before, and I'll do it again. In the West, authority ate up tradition. In the East, tradition ate up authority. Obviously, both are wrong. And secondly, in the West, we'll tolerate any amount of heresy, but no schism. In the East, they'll tolerate any amount of schism, but no heresy. Again, that's really not the way to do it. And until we realize that the schism, until we realize to the bottom of our bones that the schism is a sin, very much responsible for the terrible states all of us are in, then we'll never get anywhere. It was because of the schism that the Crusades failed. It was because of the schism that Constantinople fell. It was because of the schism that the Ottoman Turks were able to besiege Vienna twice. And it was because of the schism that the Barbary pirates ruled the Mediterranean for a couple of centuries. But we didn't pick up on it. We didn't catch on. The schism made communism ever so much worse. And I'll tell you, there was precious little sign of schism in the Siberian camps. And this I know from people who were there. So, that's what I have to say about that.
Question from Daniel of Miami. Hello, Charles. I've been reading Puritan's Empire.
Oh, was that a plug?
Yes, it is. And so far, I am really enjoying it. I just finished reading the sections pertaining to the French and Indian War and the American Revolution. My question is more of a curiosity of the economic state of Great Britain, France, and Spain after the American Revolution. Especially Great Britain, since it was more or less bankrupt in the aftermath of the French and Indian War and started to tax the colonies to alleviate its financial problems. How did Britain, as well as France and Spain, handle its financial and economic issues after the war, since it had to deal with the French Revolution and later Napoleon Bonaparte and the wars that followed? Was there an elongated economic stagnation in this era, or not at all?
Well, that's a good question, and I'm not an economic historian, so what I'm going to tell you could be wrong. but I hope not. I don't think so. We'll see. But basically, remember that the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War, and the Revolution were one of an ongoing series of wars, starting, I'm sorry to say, about 1686 with the War of the Grand Alliance that went on until 1698 or something. I forgot precisely. Very rapidly, and that was fought on all continents. It was a world war in the Age of Sail. Then in 1702, you've got the War of Spanish Succession that grinds on until 1713. And between those two wars, the European powers were exhausted. Spain was shattered. France and Britain were both exhausted. So you didn't have any other major war until 1740, 1742, 1744. Anyway, whenever it was. The War of the Austrian Succession. And that ground on until 1748. You have another war, 1756, starts the 7 Years' War, the French Indian War. I mean, in all these wars, they really emptied the treasuries of all the countries involved. They weren't as bloody. I mean, well, portions of them were. In certain areas, they were pretty bad. But by and large, they weren't quite as bloody or as filled with wars against civilians as things like the 30 Years' War had been. But they were not fun. And then, of course, came the War of the American Revolution that lasted from 1775 to 1783. So the European economies were not really in the best of shape, to say the least. And then in 1788, you had the great Icelandic volcano that caused half the crops in Western Europe, especially in France, to fail. And that was the start of the Great Hunger, which, because the government was bankrupt, basically, the French couldn't do what the king couldn't do what he would normally have done, which was buy grain and feed the affected areas, because they had nothing to buy it with. And that was the launching pad for the French Revolution. But then what do? You get another set of wars. Again, world wars fought on every continent. From 1792 for 10 years to 1798. Yeah, 1792 to 1798. Short break, 4 years. 1802, they go back to the wars, and they last until 1815, with the addition of our own War of 1812 sort of on the sidelines as part of the whole deal. Well, that whole thing was a mess. And Europe came out of that cycle utterly exhausted, which is probably why there wasn't another major war in Europe for 100 years.
Okay, question from Luke. Is Mr. Coulombe familiar with the writings of the French philosopher Rene Guenon? And if so, what does he think of them?
Well, Rene Guenon, just so you'll know. For us French people, it's Guenon. Just so you'll know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the answer is not much. I'm not what you would call a Guénon fan by any stretch. I'll explain why. Guénon and his disciples are often called perennialists. And they believe basically that there is a common revelation to all mankind underlying all religions, but that some religions are pure expressions than others. But nevertheless, they're all connected. And this is kind of a secret doctrine, in a sense. While I certainly believe that there was an original, on the one hand, there was an original revelation vouchsafed our first parents, which survived in a purer version amongst the Jews than anybody else. And then, of course, has come to fruition in Catholicism. Guénon saw Islam as a purer form of that initial thing, and he became a Muslim. So I really don't have much use for that. And I think that they have the wrong end of the telescope. Rather than Catholicism being a version or an expression of perennial truth, I would say it is the expression of perennial truth. Perfect form of wisdom available to mankind. Not in need of any addition or any subtraction.
Okay. What place does love of the nation hold? Oh, excuse me, from Joseph. Question from Joseph. What place does love of the nation hold in the ideal Catholic patriotism? For example, would a Welshman be justified in loving Wales more than Britain and being more proud of being a Welshman than a Briton, so long as he fulfills his obligation to love and defend the British state?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, with Wales in particular, I would recommend a book called Sons of the Romans, The Tory as Nationalist by H.W.T. Edwards. Edwards was a friend of Chesterton and Belloc and a convert to Catholicism, in no small part because he saw Catholicism, as did another Welsh nationalist, Saunders Lewis, as the proper ancestral faith of the Welsh people, which it certainly is. So, you know, yes, I mean, it's like being a Californian or a Texan in a sense, except that the Welsh have an identity and a nationality all their own. But I agree. I mean, that's why there's a feast of all the saints of Wales. And that's why Wales has its own patron saint, St. David. You know, to give you an illustration, they called 7 patron saints of different countries the 7 defenders of Christendom. And these were St. George for England, St. Denis for France, St. Andrew for Scotland, St. Patrick for Ireland, St. David for Wales, St. James for Spain, and...
last but not least...
St. Anthony for Italy.
Waiting for you to get to Italy. I don't care about these other countries. Get to Italy.
Why, do you have a particular interest in Italy for some reason?
Yes.
Really? Okay. Why?
Because I'm Italian.
Oh, you are?
Yeah.
You're Italian?
Yeah. Surprising,
honestly?
huh? Yeah.
You mean like la 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 la, all that stuff?
Yeah, like that.
Italian? You mean like spaghetti and meatballs?
Okay, let's just stop there before you besmirch Italian culture even more.
What's the besmirch? The Italians gave us Leonardo da Vinci.
Okay, yeah, let's stop there before it gets to low culture type things.
What low culture? Michelangelo.
Yeah, that's good. That's right.
See, I think you're fearful. I think you're suspicious of me. That's what I'm sensing this. I'm sensing this.
Well, as you like to say, it's that feeling of a knife in the back that sort of creates that fear and suspicion.
Now, you see how unreasonable that is?
How is that unreasonable?
I think it's terribly unreasonable. I mean, look at the nuclear option. I could bring up as an example of Italian high art and culture, Madonna. But if I did, there'd be a problem with that.
Because because you're related to her.
Exactly. It's the nuclear option, you see. I mean, if I brought up Madonna as an example of Italian high culture to kind of, you know, smack you around, put you in your place, you'd come back at me with, yeah, well, she's your cousin.
Okay.
So that's why I'm not going to bring up Madonna.
Well, you just did.
No, I didn't. You did.
No, I didn't, actually. All right.
Well, somebody brought up Madonna, and I'm offended.
Well, don't bring up Madonna, then. Stop offending yourself, Charles.
Well, if I don't, who will? Gotcha there, my big guy. Yeah. You don't have an answer for that one, do you? Ha!
All right, you showed me. You really got me on this one.
I'll say. Well, that sounds almost medieval.
I like how
William of Tampa.
I like this trend in these names. These people are identifying as like Daniel of Miami, William of Tampa.
Yeah, I like that. Localism.
Yeah, it's good.
Remember, every nation is a union of localities.
That's true.
Well,
All right, he says, Mr. Coulombe, I have truly enjoyed your discussions of folklore, especially as it intertwines with the different seasons of the Catholic year. I'm wondering if you have any interest in the various begging traditions that often occur between October and January, and if you have any feelings on certain traditions like the Marie Loidi of Wallis.
Wales.
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 Oh, wow. I thought that was like that's a typo.
Strange place.
That's
Wallis.
Oh.
I knew her. Wallis Dupree. She was Oswald Squeeze.
Okay.
I asked you not to bring up Oswald anyway.
Also, do you have any thoughts of the old UK kingdom of building St. James grottos? I grew up Methodist and am now a Catholic who attends Latin Mass. I still have a strong interest in folklore and always enjoy noting the relationships between folk traditions and Catholic traditions.
Oh.
I know they don't always mesh well, but sometimes they seem to coexist with minimal tension. Thank you. Thanks for your consideration.
Well, all right, that's a really good question. And the answer, when he speaks about begging traditions such as the Mari, I'm not even trying to pronounce Welsh.
Yeah.
Because I'll look even stupider than I normally do. So we'll just leave it at that.
Just let me handle the poor pronunciations, and that's how
you handle the poor pronunciations, and I handle the ones I know.
There you go.
Yeah, it's kind of like, well, it's kind of like when you're at a friend's house, and you're holding the baby, and oh, isn't he cute? It's like that.
Got it.
So the thing is that there's a whole family of these traditions. Let me go to the bottom first. The reason why these folk traditions generally mesh very well, even the English folk traditions, is because they developed over a long time under the influence of the faith. And as Ronald Hutton of the Birth and Death of Merry England fame has it, these old customs in England, and by extension Scandinavia, northern Germany, and the rest of the Protestant Europe, these old customs date from the old religion, all right, but the old religion isn't Wicca, it's Catholicism. And these are remnants of folk Catholicism that have survived to our own day, like the St. James grottos. So, yeah, I mean, they're wonderful. Now, the begging traditions to which he refers are, again, like our own trick-or-treating, which is sort of a modern version of souling, or the mummers who went from door to door doing plays, sort of mummers plays they were called, oddly enough. And they would come in costume, and they perform a sort of play at every house. It wasn't three acts and all night long, but usually there'd be several stock characters, maybe St. George and the Dragon, the doctor, the fool, the wife, and there were a number of these stock characters. And inevitably, St. George would kill the dragon in the end. The dragon might kill St. George, and the doctor would bring him back to life. And then he'd kill the dragon, things like that. It was sort of stock. They were done every year in the same way. Interestingly enough, as late, anyway, as the 1940s, and maybe they still go on, there were still mummers plays done in North Carolina, in the mountains of North Carolina and western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee. They still, in certain places, did these mummers plays, which went right back to England, as did so many of their songs, their folk songs. There's, you have to wonder when in a place like Tennessee, you kind of wonder when they sing a song like Matty Groves with its reference to King Henry at Whitehall, what that meant to the singers. Who did they think King Henry was, and what did they think Whitehall was? But nevertheless, the song survived. So I think it's all great, I think, obviously anything of this sort we do tends to be a little bit artificial, because in a lot of ways we've lost these kinds of customs. But I'm all for their revival, same with Morris dancing and all those kinds of things. It's why, in a certain sense, even the Renaissance fair and the revels, again, they're a bit artificial, but they do give you a taste of this kind of thing.
Okay. Okay, next question is from Matt.
Okay.
I heard a conference from a priest condemning the works of Tolkien, calling them Gnostic, heretical, and a promoter of the occult, and that all mythological and fantasy works contain error and should be avoided. I also wonder, what is the right and wrong way to portray magic in books and film? What do you say to that, Charles?
I say that priest is smarter than the entire Catholic world. He's smarter than the church that produced King Arthur and Charlemagne's stories. He's smarter than the church that produced Everyman. He's smarter than the fathers of the church. He's smarter than Saint Anthony the Abbot, who met up with a unicorn and not a unicorn, a centaur and a faun, according to Saint Jerome. He's smarter than the entire church prior to the Industrial Revolution. That's what I would say.
What does that have to do with Tolkien's writings?
Because Tolkien was deeply steeped in medieval Catholicism, and that's exactly what informed his imagination. He was a philologist, not a priest. And his imagination was formed by everything from Sir Gawain and the Green Knight to Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales. But being a priest, I'm sure this man is more brilliant than all the Catholics who came before us. So I'll let him have that one because he's a priest and he's smart and stuff.
I think this is an example of people going too far in the other direction, you know?
Not just too far in the other direction, of people not having any grasp of Catholic culture. I mean, it's the sort of thing that leads to that unique, mutatis mutandis, that unique New England phenomenon, Irish Catholic Puritanism.
Really?
Yeah, because they have no concept or knowledge of what Catholic culture is like. Remember that part of the problem with the Irish was that their culture was wrecked by English invasion and oppression under Cromwell and Elizabeth and Henry. So, I mean, that's why the Irish Church, which, gives us so many wonderful illuminated missals in the Middle Ages, after the Reformation, so-called, is almost aliturgical. It's difficult to have beautiful processions and so forth when just offering the Mass alone is illegal. So, I mean, there were reasons to these things. It's not like people sat around saying, I know, let's be stupid and annoying. It'd be a great thing to do. No, people don't do that. But American Catholics tend to have a very light grasp on Catholic culture and Catholic history. And they see everything through a very limited lens. The political equivalent of that is Americanism. John Courtney Murray. But they're all smarter. All these guys are smarter than than the majority of Catholics who've lived since the coming of our Lord. So I'll chalk it all up to them. John Courtney Murray was right. The Republic is the best form of government. The American Republic is the only really Catholic form of government that ever existed. St. Robert Bellarmine wrote the Declaration of Independence. How do I improve on this? You should only read the Baltimore Catechism. Never read fiction. Don't listen to music unless it's Gregorian chant, but only Gregorian chant of the versions approved in 1950. Don't you be getting wild with that Ratisbon stuff.
What about the right and wrong way to portray magic in books and film?
Well, there's fiction and there's nonfiction. Magic as our medieval ancestors understood it, described a great many things, a great many different things. The one thing that made them all magic was very simple: the accomplishment of certain ends out of all proportion to the means employed. So in other words, I put my hand out, and a book comes flying through the air, and I grab it. That's magic. Yeah. Ah, but how did that happen? Did a demon bring it to me? Did an angel bring it to me? Did an elf, a fairy, bring it to me? Do I have some strange innate power that brought it to me? That's what differentiates the different kinds of magic to the medieval mind, and also the purpose to which it's used.
I see.
So, what are the two things that you should always have in any coverage of magic in film or books? Well, number one, demons are always evil. Number two, even good ends involving demons are swiftly corrupted. That, by the way, was one of the points of the Lord of the Rings. And by the way, while we're talking about Lord of the Rings, I hate to interrupt the priest's learned discourse about Gnosticism and so forth, which is another word most people don't understand at all. Gnosis, Gnosticism, back in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, these were words like democracy today. All sorts of people claimed it. Even church fathers claimed it for real Catholicism, like St. Clement of Alexandria. What did it mean? Well, gnosis is the gnosis cardios, the knowledge of the heart, the saving knowledge that brings salvation. What made one group that used it different from another was the nature of that saving knowledge. For St. Clement of Alexandria, it was simply the Catholic faith. That's the saving knowledge. Full stop, end of story. But other groups had all sorts of peculiar and bizarre doctrines that they considered to be the real saving knowledge. And some of these were, not all, but some of them, had to do with dualism, which is the idea that there are two equal gods, one good God who made the spiritual stuff, the soul and all that kind of thing, and angels and so on. But then there was the evil God, and he made matter, and he trapped our souls in matter. And the real gnosis will allow you to escape the trap of matter. And this notion was picked up by later groups like the Manichaeans, the Cathars, the Albigenses. And it led them into all sorts of interesting errors. For instance, if you look at the Bible and you decide that the creator of matter is evil, well, then the God of the Old Testament is evil. And the serpent becomes the good guy. So you can see how that could very easily slip into Satanism. And it did, often enough. Not always, but often enough. And then, of course, all the heroes become villains and vice versa. You could also see, as the Albigenses did, that you could say, well, all earthly authority is evil. It has no authority over the enlightened. And so it went. And there are a ton of errors you can pull out of the same mix. But saying all Gnosticism, all Gnosis is the same is like saying everything that calls itself democratic is democracy. And you know, one of my favorite lines from the late lamented 1970s is that we Americans have representative democracy, the Soviets have people's democracy, and Idi Amin called cannibalism nutritional democracy. Words are slippery things. Anyway, to say one more word about Tolkien. Tolkien's oeuvre is really a meditation on the relationship between providence and free will, imagined in a pre-Christian world. And in that sense, it works very well, because just as in our world, the real world, God's will is often manifested to us through events, so too in Middle Earth. There's the famous line where, which is butchered in The Hobbit, absolutely wrecked. No, I'm sorry, I'm lying. That's another line. The line actually was not done too badly in the movie version of Lord of the Rings, is where Gandalf says to Frodo, "No, one thing is certain: you were meant to find the ring, or Bilbo was meant to find the ring, and not by its owner." That actually is obviously referring to the divine will. Secondly, not by its maker, rather. Sorry. Secondly, the line that is so butchered in The Hobbit, which in the Lord of the Rings appears in the appendix. It's when Gandalf is explaining how he met Thorin Oakenshield. So what should happen, but that if you remember in the business of The Hobbit, Gandalf meets Bilbo, recruits him to go on the dwarves' mission to kill the dragon, and so on, and all that happens. Well, at the end of Lord of the Rings, in the appendix, he explains how much after everything has happened, he explains that had they not killed the dragon, there would have been all sorts of terrible things that happened. And he gives this long laundry list. After having said that, he chanced to run across Thorin Oakenshield at the inn at Bree. Thorin and the gang told him what they were planning to do, and he said, "Well, hold on there. You better not go after that without having a hobbit as your burglar." And that was what inspired them to go to the Shire, and that's how he found Bilbo. Well, so he gives this long laundry list of the terrible things that would have happened, and then ends it by saying, "Perhaps Dragonfire and Lorien, and no queen in Gondor." But none of that happened, because I happened to meet Thorin Oakenshield one night at the inn at Bree. A chance meeting, as we say in Middle-earth. Now, in The Hobbit, it's made to sound as though Gandalf had planned it all from the beginning, which totally blows the whole point. The point is Gandalf did not plan it. Neither did Thorin, neither did Bilbo, neither did Thorin Oakenshield, neither did the dragon. It was planned by the unseen divine will. And the other big appearance of the divine will in Lord of the Rings is, of course, when Gollum achieves the quest of the ring. Frodo fails. It's Gollum who succeeds. He wins and loses himself. He goes to hell. But in doing what he does, he rescues the world, saves Bilbo's soul, really, which is about to be lost. All because both Bilbo and Frodo spared his life out of pity. And so even he plays his role at the end. And so if you look at history, you look at things like John XII, that horrible pope, approving the Charter of Cluny. History and everyday life are replete with the divine will working itself out in real time like that. And that is the lesson of Lord of the Rings. I'm sorry if that's too Gnostic or occult for the dear father. And as I say, I understand he knows better than everybody else. And that's good.
Gosh, we really hone in on different things in Lord of the Rings. It's really testament to how great of a book it is, where different people can hone in on totally different things. Because for me, it's a lot more about the emotional content regarding hope, and also too the different cultures and the different and the histories of the different races. Absolutely.
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. It's such a rich tapestry. I mean, the man was a genius. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Okay, and the next question is from Ryan. A heresy hidden in our modern day, in plain sight, are the self-help books. Am I right in thinking this? For people like me who aren't as smart as Charles and aren't doing very well in life, could perhaps help themselves by reading a self-help book. In works by Napoleon Hill, in the better-known book The Secret, there is an occult undertone. Despite quoting Jesus throughout, the ideas in the books occasionally originate from ancient pagan philosophies and even so-called ancient spirits being channeled through the teachers, as in the case of The Secret. As a Roman Catholic, should I avoid self-help books, or is it safe to benefit from them?
Well, I'm going to make a terrible, terrible admission, and that is that I've never read a self-help book in my life. I never read Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill. I never read How to Make Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. I've never read The Secret. I've never read What Color Is Your Parachute. I've never read, oh gosh, all those stuff. I'm Okay, You're Okay. I never read that either. So, you sound very much, you being he and not you, you sound very much alert to the thing. I've never given it a moment's thought, frankly, and you're likelier to be right on this than me. You know, if he has these experiences, if he sees this in this, I mean, I wouldn't be surprised. A lot of this sort of, Norman Vincent Peale kind of stuff. I mean, this is just how I feel personally. It's certainly not Holy Writ, but I always felt a little wary of the whole idea of the prosperity gospel and all that kind of stuff, demonstrating abundance and this kind of thing. It may be that our questioner knows something that the rest of us have missed. I really am not in the best position to know, but the very fact that he feels that way and that he's made some study of it might lend some credence to his view, which is, I mean, basically, he's asking me if I think his view is right or wrong. I'm not in a position to say, but it does sound like he's really put some thought and study into it. So, if a good rule of thumb in life, in general, if you're wary of something, stay away from it. You know, because even if objectively speaking, it may not be bad for others, if it's raising your hackles, it probably wouldn't be any good for you. And again, my ignorance in this area is so huge that I have to tell our questioner that he knows much more about it than I do. And this is an area where I would definitely respect his opinion more than my own.
Yeah, it seems like he does know something with the occult undertone mentioning here. I will say this, that therapy in general, like their approach is very non-judgmental and secular, which I think it's deficient. It's inherently deficient because they approach from an avenue that the spiritual could approach as well. You know, like a secular therapist can do a lot of the same things, except not as well that a priest can do. You see?
Yeah.
And you see this a lot. I haven't read self-help books, but I've watched various videos, like on YouTube, like how to have confidence or something like that. And it shows, actually the one video I'm referring to, I think it's by the channel Charisma on Command, and it explains the confidence of Don Draper, which was interesting to me. Or one of the things. And in the video, it explains, what is confidence rooted in? And he, I think rightly says, confidence is rooted in the belief that no matter what happens, you're going to be fine. And so the secular view of that is kind of empty. But now, then you start applying Catholic thought into it. Like, for example, we have a wonderful book called The Book of Confidence. And, see, Catholics derive their confidence from the belief in the glorious mysteries, the joyful mysteries. See, it's the belief that God wants everything to be all right, that everything is going to be all right. As long as you're rooted in faithfulness. See, so in other words, Catholic confidence is rooted in faithfulness. And the more faithful you are to the church and her teachings, the more confidence you are naturally going to have. You see? The more you meditate on the glorious mysteries, the more you meditate on joyful mysteries, the more confidence you're going to have in life in general, because you know that underneath it all, everything is going to be fine. Isn't that interesting? And that's something that no self-help book can touch in such a nice way. You see? So that's my 2 cents on the limitations and the dangers of self-help. Okay. Next question is from Jeff and Kim. Our next 3 questions. In her book, Utopia Nowhere, Miss Solange Hertz emphasizes the role of the Kingdom of France in relation to the Church. She seems to imply that where France goes, the Church in Europe follow. She also seems to ignore the Holy Roman Empire's role in relation to the Church in Europe. Can you compare the roles of the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire in relation to the Church and Europe?
I certainly can. And I can use as a simile, frankly, to their proper roles, a complementary, the way East and West was supposed to be in the Church. Because both the Holy Roman Emperors and the kings of France saw themselves as successors of Charlemagne. And indeed, the coronation sword in both sets of regalia, of course, the crown jewels in both countries, is called the Sword of Charlemagne. Up until the 1500s, the Holy Roman Emperors were crowned as kings of Germany. They're crowned in Rome as Holy Roman Emperors, but they're crowned in Germany in a town called Aix-la-Chapelle, Aachen, where the shrine of Charlemagne is. But interestingly, when the French kings would die, after their royal funerals in Paris, their shroud would be sent for another Requiem Mass to be said at the same church in Aachen where the Holy Roman Emperors were crowned. And of course, Charlemagne's posthumous coat of arms is always seen as half of the double eagle on one side, and the other half the lilies of France. So I'm not surprised Solange didn't dwell very, very long or greatly on the role of the Holy Roman Empire, because she was French. So am I. But as a rule, French writers in these areas don't. They look solely at France, just as German and to some degree Italian and certainly Austrian, Hungarian, Bohemian writers will talk about the Holy Empire to the exclusion of France. The reality is that they were intended, I believe, to be complementary. And the proof of the pudding is that just as the schism between East and West ended in disaster for everyone, as I said earlier in tonight's podcast, the antipathy between France and the Holy Roman Empire did the same. And it lasted for a good 200 years, from the 1550s to the 1750s, by which time it was healed with the wedding of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. But by that time, the damage was done. And what was the damage? The survival of the Protestant revolt. And it also contributed to the success of the Ottomans fighting the Austrians. The only thing you could say for it is that it did allow the French to intervene on behalf of the Christians in the Holy Land. And all the privileges that the Christians there have today, the ownership of the churches, it's why the Holy Sepulchre isn't a mosque. It's why all these churches are still in Christian hands. It's because while allied with the Turks against the Habsburgs, the French were able to demand certain concessions from the Sultan, which he was not in a position to refuse. So God brings good out of evil. But just as one cannot begin to imagine what good would have come out of a united East and West, one can't begin to imagine the good that would have come out of France and the Holy Roman Empire being allied.
Okay. Jeff and Kim ask, have you read the brothers Karamazov? What do you think of the elder Zosima's teaching and Dostoevsky's philosophy of life?
Oh gosh, to be brutally frank, I read the brothers Karamazov back in high school. And I've read a few things by Dostoevsky since, but I am not really competent to answer the question, and I apologize. I know he's a great writer. I know I should be better equipped and more familiar with him than I am, but I'm not, and I regret it. I'll have to fill that lacuna.
All right. Their last question, what do you think of Father Manuel Santa Cruz Loidi? There seem to be different takes on his story. Some of the opinion that he was a priest turned brigand, while others say he was a noble priest warrior. Which one is correct?
Well, it comes to a matter of opinion, doesn't it? But I hold he was a noble priest warrior. So since it's me, I'm right. But he was, you know, he came from a Carlist family and fought in the Second Carlist War, I think. Third Carlist War, 1870s. And then he went to Colombia as a missionary and continued the same war in the same role in the civil war between the conservatives and liberals there. So he was definitely part of the church militant. Nobody ever accused him of, you know, being uncaring.
I like these priest-warrior figures. Don't they sort of break the mold, though, between perhaps chivalry and the clerical side? Because you talked about this before, how there's two sides that don't understand each other. There's like the clerics and what is the knights, or what was the other side?
Yeah, the knights and the clerics. Well, that's true generally, but you will find exceptions on either side. So on the clerical side, you'll see people like Father Loidi, you'll see St. Lawrence of Brindisi, Blessed Marco d'Aviano, St. John Capistran, who were all priests who led troops in battle. But then contrary-wise, you'll see people like St. Nuno of Portugal, St. Louis of France, St. Ferdinand, who were, the last two were kings, all three were knights, but they had the religiosity of priests.
Interesting.
So, I mean, as a rule, it's very hard to bridge that gap. But every now and then, from one side or the other, comes somebody who does.
All right. Question from John.
Okay.
I would love to know Charles's take on the Protestant idea of being a bastion of Western civilization, it bringing forward liberty, economic progress, and cultural and scientific growth. Are those claims justified? As a relevant aside, why does it seem that Catholic countries were dominated by the Protestant countries, such as the U.S. over everywhere, the U.K. on continental Europe, and Prussia on Austria, etc.?
Well, to answer the last question first, which we've been doing kind of regularly on this show, bear in mind that Catholic countries, how do I put this? When they're truly Catholic, they're not as interested in conquest and dominance of their neighbors as they are in the common good and leading the good life for their citizens, which can put them at risk with the more aggressive, not to say nasty, Protestant nations. You know, in Protestant countries, this was a problem that plagued France and Austria in their wars with Britain and Prussia, in that Britain and Prussia would completely mobilize for the war effort. They would squeeze their subjects unmercifully to get money out of them to continue the fight. Whereas the French and the Austrians just didn't have the wherewithal to do so. It wasn't even in the mechanism. You had two very different types of states oriented toward two very different ends. In the United States, the country we dominated to our south was Mexico. But remember that we gave Mexico 20 years of softening up from within. after our friend Ambassador Poinsett, after whom the Poinsettia plant is named, introduced Freemasonry to Mexico, which had the effect of hollowing the country out from within. 20 years later, we went to Mexico, to war with Mexico, and they didn't do very well. And, of course, we've always made a point since then to attack any government in Mexico that might be independent and Catholic, and to support its enemies to the hilt. That's why we supported Juarez, first against the conservatives, and then against Maximilian. That's why we supported Calles against the Cristeros. That's always been our policy down there. That's why our ambassador was part of the plotting to knock off Garcia Moreno in Ecuador. Anytime there was an effective Catholic leader in Latin America, we would do our best to get rid of him.
Did the Enlightenment bring about an explosion of economic progress and cultural and scientific growth like never before?
Well, yes and no, no and yes. You know, a lot depends on what it is you're trying to do. For example, the Industrial Revolution made a few people extremely wealthy and made goods that had been somewhat more expensive a lot cheaper and a lot more widely available. But it was at a huge price. And the huge price was the creation of the urban proletariat, the factory people. And until the 1870s and 80s in certain countries in Europe, these guys were all on their own, and their living conditions were miserable. Now, was that progress? Well, yes and no, no and yes. It was progress for the mill owners and the factory owners. It was progress for the wealthy. It was not progress for the poor. And it created socialism, which was not progress for anybody. The whole, I mean, this is why socialism became so strong in Protestant countries. In Scandinavia, the Netherlands, Great Britain, Germany, which was dominated by the Protestant North. They all became extremely socialistic because they had extreme misery and poverty. And yet that misery and poverty both stimulated their economies, gave them the wherewithal to conquer or dominate their neighbors, and allowed them to outdo Catholic countries. But where would you have rather lived?
I hate this war over words, and like the most important of words. I just can't stand progress, freedom, love, hate. It seems like Satan has to change the meaning of everything. Everything has to be distorted and perverted to suit the new world order. It's...
No, what's wrong with that? As long as it benefits our masters, we know it's good.
Of course.
I don't want to have to report you. Please try and avoid thought crime in the future.
Oh, man. Okay, next question is from James. Could Charles explain the legend of the Secret Church of John? In particular, how does the Secret Church of John relate to the traditional distinction between the Church's militant, the Church penitent, and the Church triumphant?
Well, all right. The notion of the Secret Church of John is one that has been used by a lot of different groups through the years, usually anti-Catholic. They might be Orthodox, tending with a big O. They might be Protestant. They might be quote-unquote esoteric. But the mythos is basically that there are two churches. The Church of John, which is the church of love and the mystical stuff and prayer. And then there's the Church of Peter, the Church of rules, the Church of regulations, and sometimes the Church of ritual. And these two churches are always at war with each other. The Church of Peter is always persecuting and trying to destroy the Church of John. And the Church of John is love. Now, according to whichever version you want to look at, the Church of John could be the proto-Protestants or proto-Baptists, who otherwise are completely unknown to history. Or it could represent the difference in some people's minds between the spirit of orthodoxy and the spirit of Catholicism, orthodoxy with a big O. Or, if you're more esoterically inclined, it starts out with the real Gnostics, of whom we spoke earlier. It goes on through the Knights Templar, the Rosicrucians, the Freemasons, into this sort of esoteric underground that the church has always tried to destroy, and now can be seen in various groups from Theosophy to the Great I Am. Or else, it's a completely invisible thing, an intangible thing entirely, and is made up simply of the holy souls in every age who are in communion with each other and the divine, that are too holy ever to actually meet on earth, but await union in heaven. So it's completely invisible and intangible. That's the idea of the Secret Church of John. And it is poppycock. Now, what relationship does it have to the Church Triumphant, the Church Militant, and the Church Suffering? Well, basically, it's the idea that all real Christians are already members of the Church Triumphant. And the Church Militant and the Church Suffering, well, they're not real Christians.
What? Why?
Well, because if you're in purgatory, you're not perfect. So you can't really be a member of the Church of John. And if you're militant, you're certainly not perfect either. Basically, members of the Church of John are already in the Church Triumphant.
Even though they're on Earth?
Only while they're on Earth, and they're going to go straight to heaven because they're wonderful.
Wait, I'm confused. I thought the Church Triumphant. I thought the Church Triumphant, by definition, are people who are in heaven and not on Earth.
That's only the view of the Church of Peter.
What? I'm lost. These people are whacked out.
Hey, stop that.
Let's get to the next question. This is too crazy.
Well, what's interesting about it, though, I will say this much, is the effect it can have in terms of morality. Because for some of them, they have to be ultra, ultra strict. Maybe no meat, no dairy, etc., etc., etc. Very ascetic. All right? But then the other route you could take is that since you're already united with the saints in heaven, you can do anything you want.
Reminds me of the divine will, Luisa Picaretta stuff, where you can do whatever you want. You're united with the divine will or whatever.
It's actually some people, now mind you, not everybody who holds to the esoteric Church of John, the Secret Church of John, believes that. But some, they're very similar to the divine will people.
All right, next question's from Big Gator.
Hey, Big Gator, wow. Hide the little dogs. And the chickens. We don't want Big Gator coming around at dinner time and snapping them up. I've seen big gators in Florida. I know what they do. And Louisiana. They're all, you can't trust them.
I like gators. Gators, it's one of those animals, because whenever they have their mouths open, it just looks like they're so happy.
Yeah, they are. They're even happier when they get to close them on something, like a little dog or a chicken.
All right, he says, Charles, if the definition of Christian means one who follows Christ, how is it that we call Protestants Christian? They don't follow Christ. If they did, they would enter his bride, the church. I don't understand this separated brethren philosophy at all. Brethren means brother, I believe. So how can they be my brothers in the faith when they actually reject the true faith of Christ, which is the Holy Catholic Church? I'm confused.
Well, we've got every reason to be. we call them Christian out of courtesy. That's all. And there are quote unquote brothers in the sense that they're not atheists and they believe in Christ in some sense. I say in some sense not to be mean, but simply because the Christ of most Protestants is not the Christ of the Catholics and the Orthodox. Because that Christ comes down on the altar every day and is a very different being from the Protestant Jesus. Now, mind you, the late lamented Bill Zook was the man who, a convert from Protestantism, who made a point I've never forgotten to me. And it made sense once he explained it, but I'd never come to it on my own. He said, you know, when the Protestants attack us Catholics for worshiping the Virgin Mary, they're right. I said, what? I said, well, hold on. How do we look at the Blessed Virgin Mary? We look at her as someone whose intercession we ask for in prayer, whose example we try to follow, and who's an historical figure whom we revere. I said, yeah. Well, that's how Protestants are with Christ, because they don't have the sacraments. So, in other words, the worship they have for Jesus is very similar to the reverence we have for Mary. The worship we have for Jesus is completely beyond their ken.
That's a good point.
Yeah, I would never have thought of it, frankly. It took a convert to point it out to me. But as I say, to answer Big Gator's question, it's like this. We call them Christians, A, out of courtesy, and B, in the face of self-professed non-Christians. But you're quite right about the differences between us.
They do at least have a valid baptism.
Yeah, well, they do.
So
and
that's something. Baptism does stuff.
It can, depending on the person's free will. Yeah.
All right. Next question from Christopher. Hi, Charles. What is your opinion on the post-Meiji restoration, imperialist Japan? Were they a force for good or bad in the world? Was the attack on Pearl Harbor justified?
Well, they were certainly a mixed bunch. If I were to say that the attack on Pearl Harbor was justified, I would have to say the attack on Iraq was justified, since they were both what's the word I'm looking for? Preemptive strikes. And if I wouldn't go along with Mr. Bush, I can't go along with Tojo. But we certainly did push them into that position, which was not a good thing to do. Were they a force for good or for evil? Well, a mixed bag. Certainly, the deification of the emperor was not really a good idea. And it's important to remember that it was a fairly recent thing. During World War II and immediately before, they talked about the age-old worship of the emperor. Well, that wasn't quite true. In the beginning, the Meiji Restoration, for those who don't know, in 1867, after 10 years of Japan being subjected, as China had been, to foreign control, foreign semi-occupation, the Japanese got tired of it and said, we're not going to do this anymore. They overthrew the Tokugawa shogunate, which had ruled Japan for over 200 years, and were also the people, by the way, who banned the Catholic faith. And the emperor, who at the time was the Emperor Meiji, reassumed, in a sense, control of the country. I say in a sense because they immediately tried to remake Japan as a modern constitutional monarchy. So he got rid of all of his wives except one who became his empress. And there had not been an empress in Japan for a long time because they had had polygamy. The empress had. And for the first 30 or 40 years, Meiji reigned as the way a European monarch did. He'd go out on inspection and see people and be seen. But toward the last decades of his reign, they began to cook up the whole deification of the emperor piece. which did not take on all at once. The modernization of Japan certainly had benefits for the Japanese. It kept Japan from being dominated by the foreigners the way China was. And of course, in China, the emperor there, Kwangshu, he tried something similar, but was frustrated by the Empress Dowager, and then sort of taken a prisoner. What Chinese history would have been like if the emperor's reforms had succeeded there, nobody can know. Catholicism initially was liberated in Japan because it was seen as a Western thing, and Western things were embraced, although they were trying to hold on to Eastern traditions. And by and large, they did a fairly effective job of that. Probably the apogee of Japan's westernization under Meiji was during and after World War I, when Japan entered World War I as one of the Allies. In 1907, Japan became an ally of Great Britain. And in 1921, I guess, began the first big problem between Japan and the West. And that's what was called the Washington Naval Conference. Britain allowed her alliance with Japan to lapse, and the British and the Americans, the French and the Italians ganged up on the Japanese to limit their naval fleet to half the size of, I think, the United States or Britain, I forget. Anyway, the Japanese were not happy, but they were not in a position to resist. And the result was, during the course of the 1920s, although cultural westernization continued, the whole militaristic thing grew and grew and grew. The Japanese industrial complex had a problem, and the problem was the Japanese home islands were subject to famine. And the only way to stave off the occasional threat of famine was guaranteed deliveries of scrap metal and oil. That was what they required. And amongst the Japanese military, you had three theories that developed as to how Japan could expand to secure these things. The Northern School, which said, let's move into Siberia. The Western School, which said, let's move into China. And the Southern School, which said, let's go after Southeast Asia. Well, the Northern School had their turn of bat during the Russian Civil War, when Japan intervened and seized Vladivostok and parts of Siberia. That didn't work out very well. So they pulled out in 1922 and said, we'll forget that. 9 years later, they began the war in Manchuria and seized all of what was called Manchukuo, took the last Chinese emperor and made him emperor of Manchukuo as kind of a puppet. And then in 1936 began a war with China, and that did not do very well for them. They never got out of China what they were hoping to get, and the Chinese resistance made sure that it was a constant drain. Well, along comes 1939, 1940, and the Japanese had a prime minister named Prince Konoye, who was the leader of what was called the Peace Party. What they were basically willing to do was to pull out of China in return for an American guarantee of oil and scrap metal, because the Chinese conflict was costing them anyway. Now, the War Party said, you know, we're the sons of the emperor, we're divine, we can clean the Europeans and the Americans' clocks. All we have to do is conquer Southeast Asia. Konoye wanted to secure their needs peacefully. Now, Roosevelt, in the meantime, was very keen on getting into the war against Germany, and he beat the drum in that direction, but the Germans wouldn't be pushed, even when we torpedoed their shipping. Hitler was evil, but he wasn't stupid. So instead, we began to pressure the Japanese. And we began to issue ultimata that they needed to get out of China. Konoye responded, we'll get out of China by this and such a date if you will guarantee oil and scrap metal. He said, nope, not going to do that. Get out of China by this and such a date, or we will cut them off. Well, Japan could not survive for long if we did that. So, Prince Konoye, in an attempt to save the situation, did something very radical. He offered to come to Washington and meet with Roosevelt personally. This was a huge political risk on his part, because for a Japanese prime minister to go to see the Gaijin, that was, if it worked, fine, but if not, it was a huge loss of face. And in the event, Roosevelt refused, and so Konoye and the government fell. And now Tojo and the War Party were in charge. And they arranged for Pearl Harbor. So, was Japan a force for good? Was the Meiji Restoration a force for good? In the things I mentioned earlier, yes. But there were some really bad things. One of them being that non-Japanese, as a result of the deification of the emperor, it was sort of a deification of the Japanese race, and non-Japanese were seen as less than human. The Bushido code had one element to it that would end up with a terrible, terrible result for American and other captives of the Japanese. And that was that if a soldier surrendered, he was considered to be a traitor to the emperor. Well, they applied that same idea to soldiers of other countries who surrendered and thought of them as traitors to their own countries for having surrendered. So the treatment of our POWs was horrible. Absolutely subhuman, inhuman. And the same was true during the course of their capture of cities like Nanking, the famous rape of Nanking. So, there, it was a mixed bag, as people generally are. Japanese culture, of course, has always fascinated me. And to this day, interestingly enough, we just had the annual presentation of sacrifices on the part of the emperor and the government at the Yakasuni shrine, which enshrines the dead of the Second War, including a number of war criminals. And of course, whenever this is done, the Chinese and the Koreans get very excited and upset because so many Chinese and Koreans died at the hands of the Japanese. But, they were better than the communists. And the interesting thing is that the admiral who commanded the fleet at Pearl Harbor, Raphael Yamamoto, was a Catholic. And he had a much better understanding of the West than Tojo and the gang did. And he was against the war. And he was really against, although he commanded the squadron, Yamamoto was very much against doing this. And he said, America is a sleeping giant. Do not awaken her. And he was right, of course.
All right. Our final question today is from Robert.
Okay.
Mr. Coulombe, I wanted to start off by saying I recently found your Tumblr House talks and could listen to you talk for hours.
God bless you, my son. I wish everyone felt that way, Vinny.
What?
They could listen to me talk for hours.
I can do that too.
Well, you have to. That's different.
All right. He says, to make a long story short, I have been convinced that the Catholic faith has the truest understanding of truth and seek conversion. My question I have for you is, how do you cultivate a lay life in Christ when not only living in a modernist world, but also you come from a culture that does not have a foundation in Catholicism, Korea?
All right. Well, firstly, let me say something about Korea, and then I'll say something general. You're not entirely correct that there's no foundation in Korea. There is, and it's a very strange one. Unlike all the rest of Asia, the church in Korea was started by Korean laymen, not a priest in sight. The reason being that the Kingdom of Korea, as it was when it was in the 18th century, was a tributary of China, was totally isolated from the world. They called it the Hermit Kingdom. The one contact they had was that every year, every 2 years, whatever it was, a tribute train filled with Korean nobility bringing various gifts to the Emperor of China would make its way from Korea to Peking. Well, it so happened that one of the people on that expedition one year was a Korean nobleman who read Chinese very well, which they did. It was part of what the nobility, or the Yangban, as they were called, did. So this Korean nobleman went to the Imperial Library in Peking and found the writings of Father Matteo Ricci, almost 200 years old, in Chinese, copied them down and brought them back to Korea. By the time the first missionaries arrived in the 1820s, I think, there was something like 5,000 catechumens waiting to be baptized.
Wow.
Yeah. And in the period following that, under various reigns, a number of Koreans were martyred for the faith. The story of St. Andrew Kim and the Korean martyrs is one that is not nearly sufficiently known in the West, or apparently in Korea either. So it's not entirely true to say that there's no background to it in Korea. There is, but it's quite possible that you haven't heard about it. So, and this is true for everybody that's interested in the faith, you need to do some research into the history of the faith in your own locality and find out what people did, how they did it, and so on. And it may be that you come from an area that has sort of a multiple personality as far as Catholicism is concerned. Regular Latin Catholicism, but maybe there were Anglican settlers, so you want to look into the Ordinariate. Or maybe there were Greek settlers, so you want to look into the Byzantines. And so it goes. But you could do it, it's just it takes a good deal of study and a good deal of research. Now, granted, plugging into this would be somewhat artificial for you. But that's something we all have to do now. Rebuilding a Catholic sense almost means an exercise in artificial intelligence. Because the world we all live in is so different from the Catholic world that it was. So we have to reconquer it, and we have to start with our own minds. But believe it or not, you do have a very firm foundation on the faith in Korea, and I hope that you'll plug into it and come in.
Okay. All right, that'll do it for this episode. But again, as I've said last show, that doesn't mean this doesn't replace our Monday episode. We're going to also have a Monday episode. You should be seeing this on Thursday. So remember, if it's Thursday, it's off the menu.
Really? Well, that may or may not be true, but I can guarantee you that the soul you save
may be your own. See you next time.
God bless you all. In fact, we'll see you very shortly. Ciao.